Welcome to the Underclass Podcast with Austin Picard. I'm an independent researcher who can't stomach being lied to on a daily basis by the mainstream media, while we live in a fracturing society launched into parallel realities, falling perfectly onto the two sides of the political spectrum. I remain in the underclass. What if I told you that an organization existed with the primary goal of systematically discrediting victims of child sexual abuse? A foundation conveniently and contemporarily created to seed a pseudoscientific falsehood into the public consciousness, while simultaneously serving as the cleanup crew for some of the most prolific crimes ever committed or facilitated as a result of covert action and clandestine special operations. In this story, we're all Manchurian candidates, escaping the confines of a society largely under hypnosis, only to find ourselves once again at the precipice, in a brave new world, under a dystopian version of mind control. One nation under Stockholm Syndrome, taken hostage and entirely consumed with defending their captors. As Aldous Huxley once said, one believes things because one has been conditioned to believe them. The nature of psychological compulsion is such that those who act under constraint remain under the impression that they are acting on their own initiative. The victim of mind manipulation does not know that he is a victim. To him, the walls of his prison are invisible, and he believes himself to be free. That he is not free is apparent only to other people. His servitude is strictly objective. The False Memory Syndrome Foundation was founded as a nonprofit organization in 1992 by Pamela and Peter Fried, who described the foundation's purpose as the examination of the concept of false memory syndrome and recovered memory therapy, as well as advocacy on behalf of individuals believed to be falsely accused of child sexual abuse. According to an article published at The Cut, given the title, The Memory War, Pam and Peter Fried weren't just husband and wife, they were also step-siblings. They met as children in Providence, Rhode Island. Pam's mother married Peter's father when Pamela was 12 and Peter was 14. Their married parents settled in New York, while Pam and Peter stayed behind in Providence. She lived with her father and stepmother, and he lived with his mother. They attended the same high school where Pam was still a student when they began dating. Before they became intimate, Peter told Pam about his involvement as a younger boy with a much older male artist, then famous in Providence. The man taught weekend art classes to children, a number of whom became his victims. The artist began sexually abusing Peter from when he was around 7 to 11 years old. Pam and Peter married in 1957 when she was 18. He was a student at Brown University, and she was at Pembroke College, Brown's school for women. Their first child, Jennifer, was born 9 months later. The article describes the last time Jennifer Fried saw her parents was in December 1990. At 33, Jennifer was a tenured professor of psychology at the University of Oregon and the mother of two young boys. Her folks, Peter and Pamela Fried, were coming for a visit over Christmas. In years past, Jennifer's sister Gwen would have been there too. But that fall, a few months before their parents were scheduled to arrive, Gwen had called Jennifer to say she wouldn't be coming. Something, she said, was deeply wrong with their family. By then, Peter Fried, a renowned mathematician, had been through rehab at Silver Hill, an elite psychiatric hospital in Connecticut favored by the famous and the wealthy. Still, Peter's years of heavy drinking weighed especially heavy on Gwen, who was 6 years younger than Jennifer. She had lived at home without her sister for the worst of it. Jennifer tried to talk Gwen into coming, but she refused. It wasn't that the sisters didn't recall the same things. They agreed that their father's behavior had been strange, even inappropriate at times. But then Gwen said something that prompted a recontextualization in Jennifer's mind, something that made her see her entire childhood in a new light. "You know our father was sexually abused, right?" Gwen asked her. "That was like an earthquake for me," Jennifer recalls 30 years later. "It was the first time those words were put to our family in any way." There were things about her father that Jennifer had previously written off as jokes or exaggerations. His repeated prideful references to his one-time status as a kept boy of a prominent artist. How he always wanted to talk about Lolita, the pen art impression of his penis that was displayed in the family's living room. But after what Gwen had said, Jennifer suddenly saw these things differently. What had once been a low-grade anxiety in the presence of her father became intolerable. Jennifer started seeing a therapist. In their second session, the therapist asked her a series of clinical intake questions: whether she smoked, how much she drank, whether she had ever been sexually abused. To the last question, Jennifer gave a thoughtless no. Later that day, she began to remember. Jennifer has never publicly described what she says her father did to her. She sees no benefit in recounting the details. If pressed to give it a name, she says he molested her. In her earliest memory of it, she recognizes the bathroom in the house where the family lived when she was 3 years old. In her latest, she is a teenager, meaning the abuse would have spanned at least a decade. The memories didn't arrive all at once, but were staggered, resurfacing with special intensity after her parents came for their visit. The plan was just to get through it. Jennifer had told her husband JQ about her memories, and she thought she could temporarily set them aside. After all, she had lived without them well enough for years. But when her parents showed up, Jennifer found she couldn't stop worrying about her sons. That first night, she asked her husband to sleep on a camping mat in the hall outside their bedroom. It wasn't enough. In the middle of the night, Jennifer wrested her family from where they slept, and the four of them fled to the home of a colleague who had answered her panicked midnight call. In the morning, at Jennifer's request, JQ called her parents and told them they had to leave. Pam, blindsided, demanded to know why. Eventually, JQ blurted it out. "Jennifer says Peter molested her as a child, and we can't have him around our children." Peter denied his daughter's claims, but JQ found his response unsettling. He was neither disoriented nor outraged, but oddly prepared, almost as though he had been expecting it. Pam and Peter left, cutting their visit short. How should a parent respond to allegations of decades earlier abuse from an adult child? If you believe yourself or your spouse to be innocent, how should you sound on the phone? What should you do in the days and weeks after a bombshell like that? You might believe your child, or you might not. You could try to support her either way. You could cut her out of your life. Pam and Peter Fried retaliated. In the wake of Jennifer's disclosure, they formed an organization called the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. Through the nonprofit's work, they popularized the term false memory. It became one of the most effective tools to instill doubt not only about allegations of child sex abuse, but in all forms of sexual violence. Between 1992, when the foundation was launched, and December 2019, when it abruptly shuttered, it bolstered the defense strategy employed by countless sex offenders from Michael Jackson to Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein. Today, the notion that one's own memories of sexual violence are unreliable is owed in large part to how the Frieds responded to their daughter. With the support of her grandmother and uncle, in 1990, Jennifer Fried privately accused her father of sexually abusing her throughout her childhood, and Philadelphia Magazine reported that Peter Fried denied the sexual abuse, claiming that someone in the Fried household would have been aware of the alleged abuse because the family dog would have barked due to the commotion elicited by his alleged abuse. In a letter written to PBS Frontline in response to a documentary that referenced allegations of incest, Peter Fried's brother and Jennifer Fried's uncle William stated that Fried and his wife Pamela did in fact grow up in the same household as step-siblings. He also added that in his view, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation is designed to deny a reality that Peter and Pam have spent most of their lives trying to escape, and that he was certain abuse happened to his niece. By 1993, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation claimed to have more than 2,000 members, and in 1996, investigative journalist Alex Constantine explored the deep connections between the CIA and a plethora of mind control cults, even including elaborate ties to the now infamous False Memory Syndrome Foundation. He begins by citing a report out of the London Times which describes the beliefs held by Luc Jouret, Belgian cult leader, founder, and Grand Master of the Sovereign Order of the Solar Temple, who allegedly killed himself in a Swiss village on October 5, 1994, as part of a mass suicide, claiming 74 lives. Luc Jouret espoused a hybrid religion that owed more to Umberto Eco's novel Foucault's Pendulum than to any Bible. His followers called themselves Knights of Christ. The crusading codes of the Knights Templar, the rose and cross symbolism of the medieval Rosicrucian order, Nazi occultism, and New Age mysticism were joined together into a mumbo-jumbo mishmash that seemed more designed for extracting money from disciples than saving souls. Jouret, born in the Belgian Congo in 1947, set out in youth as a mystic with communist leanings, but his politics apparently swung full circle. He has since been linked to a clutch of neo-Nazis responsible for a string of bombings in Canada. He told friends that he had once served with a unit of Belgian paratroopers. French-Canadian journalist Pierre Tourangeau investigated the sect for 2 years. A few days after the mass murder, he reported that the sect was financed by the proceeds of gun running to Europe and South America. Simultaneously, Radio Canada announced that Jouret's Templars earned hundreds of millions of dollars laundering the profits through the infamous Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or BCCI, closed by authorities worldwide in 1991. Montreal's La Presse observed, each new piece of information only thickens the mystery. But the combination of international arms smuggling and BCCI presented a familiar enough picture of CIA sedition. The Manhattan DA, who closed the American branch, announced that 16 witnesses had died in the course of investigating the bank's entanglements in covert operations of the CIA, arms smuggling to Iraq, money laundering, and child prostitution. The average coffee table would crumple under the weighty BCCI Book of the Dead. Journalists Danny Casolaro and Vince Foster appear in it, grim antecedents to the Solar Temple killings. The cult's connection to BCCI, reported in Europe but filtered from American newspaper accounts, fed speculation among Canadian journalists that followers of Jouret were killed to bury public disclosures of gun running and money laundering. But the fraternizing of America's national security elite in these cults did not begin in shady Switzerland. Jouret's Order of the Solar Temple was but the latest incarnation of mind control operations organized and overseen by the CIA and Department of Defense. In 1978, Wayne Evans, a doctor from the U.S. Army Institute of Environmental Medicine, was quoted saying, "In a sense, we're in the same ethical and moral dilemma as the physicists in the days prior to the Manhattan Project. Those of us who work in this field see a developing potential for a nearly total control of human emotional status. Scientists in the CIA's mind control fraternity lead double lives. Many are highly respected, but if the truth were known, they would be deafened by the public outcry and drummed out of their respective academic haunts. Martin T. Orne, for example, a senior CIA Navy researcher, is based at the University of Pennsylvania's Experimental Psychiatry Laboratory. He is also an original member of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation's advisory board. A tightly drawn coterie of psychiatrists, many with backgrounds in CIA mind control experimentation in its myriad forms. The foundation is dedicated to denying the existence of cult mind control and child abuse. Its primary pursuit is the castigation of survivors and therapists for fabricating accusations of ritual abuse. Dismissing cult abuse as hysteria or false memory, a common defense strategy, may relieve the parents of preschool children, and in a small percentage of cult abuse cases, it's possible that children may be led to believe they've been victimized. But the CIA and its cover organizations have a vested interest in blowing smoke at the cult underground because the worlds of CIA mind control and many cults merge inextricably. The drumbeat of false accusations from the media is taken up by paid operatives like Dr. Orne and the False Memory Syndrome Foundation to conceal the crimes of the agency. Orne's forays into hypnoprogramming were financed in the 1960s by the Human Ecology Fund, a CIA cover at Cornell University and the underwriter of many of the formative mind control experiments conducted in the US and abroad, including the gruesome brainwashing and remote mind control experiments of Dr. Ewen Cameron at Montreal's Allen Memorial Institute. Research specialties of the CIA's black psychiatrists included electroshock lobotomies, drugging agents, incapacitants, hypnosis, sleep deprivation, and radio control of the brain, among hundreds of subprojects. The secondary source of funding for Dr. Orne's work in hypnotic suggestion and dissolution of memory is eerie in the cult child abuse context. The voluminous files of John Marks in Washington, D.C., 139 boxes obtained under FOIA, to be exact, 2/5 of which document CIA interest in the occult, include an agency report itemizing a $30,000 grant to Orne from Human Ecology and another $30,000 from Boston's Scientific Engineering Institute, SEI, another CIA funding cover founded by Edwin Land of the Polaroid Corporation. This was the year that the CIA's Office of Research and Development, ORD, geared up a study of parapsychology and the occult. The investigation, dubbed Project Often Chickwit, gave rise to the establishment of a social laboratory by SEI scientists at the University of South Carolina, a college class in black witchcraft, demonology, and voodoo. Dr. Orne, with SEI funding, marked out his own mind control corner at the University of Pennsylvania in the early 1960s. He does not publicize his role as CIA psychiatrist. He denies it, very plausibly. In a letter to Dr. Orne, Marks once reminded him that he'd disavowed knowledge of his participation in one mind-wrecking experimental subproject. Orne later recanted, admitting that he'd been aware of the true source of funding all along. Among psychiatrists in the CIA's mind control fraternity, Orne ranks among the most venerable. He once boasted to Marks that he was routinely briefed on all significant CIA behavior modification experiments. Why would they come to him, Martin Cannon muses in The Controllers, which links UFO abductions to secret military research veiled by screen memories of alien abduction, unless Orne had a high security clearance and worked extensively with the intelligence services. To supplement his CIA income, the influential Dr. Orne has been the donee of grants from the Office of Naval Research and the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. I should like to hear, Cannon says, what innocent explanation, if any, the Air Force has to offer to explain their interest in post-hypnotic amnesia. According to Army records, Orn's stomping grounds, Penn University, was a beehive of secret experiments in the Vietnam War period. The Pentagon and CIA, under the auspices of ORD's Steve Aldrich, a doyen of occult and parapsychological studies, conferred the agency's most lucrative research award upon the University of Pennsylvania to study the effects of 16 newly concocted biochemical warfare agents on humans, including choking, blistering, and vomiting agents, toxins, poison gas, and incapacitating chemicals. The tests were abruptly halted in 1972 when the prison's medical lab burned to the ground. Testimony before the 1977 Church Committee's probe of the CIA hinted that, as of 1963, the scientific squalor of the CIA's mind control regimen, codenamed MKUltra, had abandoned military and academic laboratories fearing exposure and mushroomed in cities across the country. Confirmation arrived in 1980 when Joseph Holsinger, an aide to late Congressman Leo Ryan, who was murdered by a death squad at Jonestown, exposed the formation of eccentric religious cults by the CIA. Holsinger made the allegation at a colloquium of psychologists in San Francisco on psychosocial implications of the Jonestown phenomenon. Holsinger maintained that a CIA rear support base had been in collusion with Jones to perform medical and mind control experiments at People's Temple. The former congressional aide cited an essay he'd received in the mail, The Penal Colony, written by a Berkeley psychologist. The author had emphasized, rather than terminating MKUltra, the CIA shifted its programs from public institutions to private cult groups, including the People's Temple. Jonestown had its gray eminence in Dr. Lawrence Laird Layton of the University of California at Berkeley, formerly a chemist for the Manhattan Project and head of the Army's Chemical Warfare Research Division in the early 1950s. Larry Layton, his son, led the death squad that murdered Congressman Leo Ryan, who'd arrived at Guyana to investigate the cult. Michael Myers, author of the book Was Jonestown a CIA Medical Experiment?, scavenged for information on the People's Temple for 6 years, concluding, the Jonestown experiment was conceived by Dr. Layton, staffed by Dr. Layton, and financed by Dr. Layton. It was as much his project as it was Jim Jones. Though it was essential for him to remain in the background for security reasons, Dr. Layton maintained contact with and even control of the experiment through his wife and children. The African American cult had at its core a Caucasian inner circle composed of Dr. Layton's family and in-laws. The press was blind to obvious CIA connections, but survivors of the carnage in Guyana followed the leads and maintained that Jim Jones was an employee, servant, agent, or operative of the Central Intelligence Agency from 1963, the year the agency turned to cult cutouts to conceal MKUltra mind control activities, until 1978. In October 1981, the survivors of Jonestown filed a $63 million lawsuit against Secretary of State Cyrus Vance and Stansfield Turner, former director of the CIA, a teacher at the University of Maryland, and a director of the Monsanto Corporation. The suit, filed in U.S. District Court in San Francisco, accused Turner of conspiring with agency operatives to enhance the economic and political powers of James Warren Jones and of conducting mind control and drug experimentation on the Temple flock. The suit was dismissed 4 months later for failure to prosecute timely. All requests for an appeal were denied. Ligatures of the CIA clung to the cults. Much of the violence that has since exploded across the front pages was incited by CIA academics at leading universities. It is beginning to dawn on the psychiatric community at large that the CIA's mind control clique is a menace reminiscent of Nazi medical experimentation. In 1993, Dr. Corydon Hammond, a professor at the University of Utah's School of Medicine, conducted a seminar on federally funded mind control experiments. Topics covered by Hammond included brainwashings, post-hypnotic programming, and the induction of multiple personalities by the CIA. Hammond contended that the cult underground has roots in Nazi Germany and that the CIA's cult mind control techniques were based upon those of Nazi scientists recruited by the CIA for Cold Warfare. Researcher Lenny Lapin estimates in Mass Murderers in White Coats that 5,000 Nazis resettled in the U.S. after World War II. Hammond was forced to drop this line of inquiry by professional ridicule, especially from the CIA's False Memory Syndrome Foundation and a barrage of death threats. At a recent regional conference on ritual child abuse, he regretted that he could no longer speak on the theme of government mind control. The psychological community is waking to the threat in its ranks, to judge by APA surveys and personal communications with ranking members of the mental health field, but the world at large remains in the dark. Mass hysteria and false memory bromides disseminated by the establishment press, obscure federal and academic connections to the mind control cults, which are defended largely by organized pedophiles, cultists, and hired guns of psychiatry. An ambitious disinformation gambit has led the world at large to side with cultists operating under federal protection. As at Jonestown and Sherry, Switzerland, the denouement of cult activity often ends in the destruction of all witnesses. This cycle of abuse and murder can only be ended by full public awareness of the federal mind control initiative. The recovered memory debate was discussed at a 1993 conference on multiple personality disorder. Richard Lowenstein, a psychiatrist from the University of Maryland Medical School, argued that the foundation is media-directed, dedicated to putting out disinformation. Other conference participants contemplated funding sources and possible CIA connections. The CIA, in fact, has several designates on the False Memory Syndrome Foundation Advisory Board. They have in common backgrounds in mind control experimentation. Their very presence on the board and their peculiar backgrounds reveal some heavily obscured facts about ritual child abuse. Martin T. Orne, a senior CIA researcher, is an original board member of the foundation and a psychiatrist at the University of Pennsylvania's Experimental Psychiatry Lab in Philadelphia. In 1962, his forays into hypnoprogramming, the elicitation of antisocial behavior, dissolving memory, and other mind-subduing techniques, were financed by a CIA front at Cornell University. He was also funded by Boston Scientific Engineering Institute, another front, and a clearinghouse for the agency's investigation of the occult. The CIA and Pentagon have formed a partnership in the creation of cults. To be sure, the Association of National Security Alumni, a public interest veterans group opposed to clandestine operations, considers it a primary issue of concern that the Department of Defense has a perceived role in satanic cult activities, which qualify in and of themselves as very damaging exercises in mind control. The smoothing over of the national security state's cult connections is handled by academic experts. The forerunner of the foundation is based in Buffalo, New York, the Committee for Scientific Examination of Religion, best known for the publication of Satanism in America, How the Devil Got More Than His Due, widely considered to be a legitimate study. The authors turn up their noses to ritual abuse, dismissing the hundreds of reports around the country as mass hysteria. Cult researcher Carl Roschke reported in a March 1991 article that he coincidentally met Hudson Frew, a Satanism in America co-author, at a Berkeley bookstore. Frew was wearing a five-pointed star, or pentagram, a symbol of witchcraft and earth magic, Roschke says. Sean Carlson, a contributor to the book, is identified by the media as a physicist, yet he runs the Gaia Press in El Cerrito, California, a New Age publishing house with an emphasis on witchcraft and occultic lore. Carlson is also a scientific and technical consultant to the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, promoter of the false memory theory of ritual abuse and UFO abductions, and publisher of the Skeptical Inquirer. The False Memory Syndrome Foundation is no less eccentric. Within 2 years of its founding, it was clear that the foundation leadership was far from disinterested on the workings of childhood memory and concealed a secret sexual and political agenda. In 1991, Peter and Pamela Fried, executive directors of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, joined forces with Ralph Underwager, director of the Institute of Psychological Therapies in Minnesota, who was later forced to resign in 1993. Underwager, a former Lutheran pastor, and his wife Holiday Wakefield published a journal, Issues and Child Abuse Allegations, written by and for child abuse skeptics. His departure from the False Memory Syndrome Foundation was hastened by a remark in an interview appearing in an Amsterdam journal for pedophiles that it was God's will adults engage in sex with children. His wife Holiday remained on the foundation's board after he left. As it happens, Holy Dispensation for Pedophiles is the exact credo of the Children of God cult. It was fitting, then, when Underwager filed an affidavit on behalf of cult members tried in France in 1992, insisting that the accused were positively not guilty of abuse upon children. In the interview, he prevailed upon pedophiles everywhere to shed stigmatization as wicked and reprehensible users of children. In keeping with the Foundation's creative use of statistics, Dr. Underwager told a group of British reporters in 1994 that scientific evidence proved 60% of all women molested as children believed the experience was good for them. Dr. Underwager invariably sides with the defense. His grandiloquent orations have graced courtrooms around the world, often by satellite. Defense lawyers for Woody Allen turned to him, he boasts, when Mia Farrow accused her estranged husband of molesting their 7-year-old daughter. Underwager is a virtual icon to the Irish Catholic lobby in Dublin, which raised its hoary hackles against a child abuse prevention program in the Irish Republic. He was, until his advocacy of pedophilia tarnished an otherwise glittering reputation, widely quoted in the press, dismissing ritual child abuse as a hysterical aberration. In the book, The CIA Doctors, Human Rights Violations by American Psychiatrists, author Colin Ross wrote that False Memory Syndrome Foundation Advisory Board members Dr. Martin Orne and Dr. Louis Jolyon West are CIA and military mind control contractors with top secret CIA clearance. Both received MKUltra contracts to study dissociative disorders, implantation of false memories, and techniques for creation of Manchurian candidates. The dissociative disorders, false memories, and the therapist-created multiple personality are the focus of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation campaign. As we now know, being a member of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation's Scientific Advisory Board is far from the top of the list of achievements for the infamous face of MKUltra, Dr. Louis Jolyon West. Not only was he sent to perform a psychological evaluation on Jack Ruby just before his psychotic break, he was also the psychologist assigned by the state to attend to Sirhan Sirhan while he was awaiting trial. The brother of the convicted co-conspirator in the Oklahoma City bombing plot, James Nichols, claims in his book Freedom's End that Timothy McVeigh was met in prison by the notorious MKUltra mind-bender himself, Dr. Louis Jolyon West, who had handled Sirhan Sirhan following the Robert Kennedy assassination and was probably there to reinforce McVeigh's programmed brain. Dr. West even had direct connections to Charles Manson through the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic and was later called in along with fellow False Memory Syndrome Foundation board member Dr. Martin T. Orne to aid in the defense of Patty Hearst. An article published at The Intercept in 2019, co-authored by Tom O'Neill, author of the book Chaos: Charles Manson, the CIA and the Secret History of the 60s, offers a unique perspective into the potential role Dr. Jolly West and his colleagues at the FMSF actually played in some of the most high-profile cases in American history. Through this dark, disturbing story, we are given a brief glimpse into the reprehensible nature of the state, as we are forced to witness yet another unimaginable consequence. The article was given the title, Inside the Archive of an LSD Researcher with Ties to the CIA's MKUltra Mind Control Project, and begins by describing, on the night of July 4th, 1954, San Antonio, Texas was shaken by the rape and murder of a 3-year-old girl. The man accused of these crimes was Jimmy Shaver, an airman at the nearby Lackland Air Force Base with no criminal record. Shaver claimed to have lost his memory of the incident. The victim, 3-year-old Cher Jo Horton, had disappeared around midnight outside the Air Force Base where her parents had left her in the parking lot outside a bar. She played with her brother while they had a drink inside. When they noticed her missing, they formed a search party. Within an hour, the group came upon a car parked next to a gravel pit. Cher's underwear was hanging from one of the car's doors. Shaver wandered out of the darkness. He was shirtless, covered in blood and scratches. Making no attempt to escape, he let the search party walk him to the edge of the highway. Bystanders described him as dazed and in a trance-like state. "What's going on here?" he asked. He didn't seem drunk, but he couldn't say where he was, how'd he gotten there, or whose blood was all over him. Meanwhile, the search party found Horton's body in the gravel pit. Her neck was broken, her legs had been torn open, and she'd been raped. Deputies arrested Shaver. At 29, he was recently remarried with 2 children and no history of violence. He'd been at the same bar Horton had been abducted from, but he'd left with a friend who told police that neither of them was drunk, though Shaver had seemed high on something. Before deputies could take Shaver to the county jail, a constable from another precinct arrived with orders from military police to assume custody of him. Around 4 that morning, an Air Force marshal questioned Shaver and 2 doctors examined him, agreeing he wasn't drunk. One later testified that he probably was not normal. He was very composed outside, which I did not expect him to be under these circumstances. He was released to the county jail and booked for murder and rape. Investigators interrogated Shaver through the morning. When his wife came to visit, he didn't recognize her. He gave his first statement at 10:30 a.m., adamant that another man was responsible. He could summon an image of a stranger with blonde hair and tattoos. After the Air Force Marshal returned to the jailhouse, however, Shaver signed a second statement, taking full responsibility. Though he still didn't remember anything, he reasoned he must have done it. 2 months later, in September, Shaver's memories still hadn't returned. The commander of the base hospital, Colonel Robert S. Bray, ordered a psychiatric evaluation to be performed by Dr. Lewis Jolyon West, the head of psychiatric services at the air base. It fell to West to decide if Shaver had been legally sane at the time of the murder. Shaver spent the next 2 weeks under West's supervision. They returned to the scene of the crime, trying to jog his memory. Later, West hypnotized Shaver and gave him an injection of sodium pentothal or truth serum, to see if he could clear his amnesia. While Shaver was under, according to testimony, he recalled the events of that night. He confessed to killing Horton. He'd brought out repressed memories of his cousin, Beth Rainboat, who'd sexually abused him as a child. Shaver had started drinking at home that night when he had visions of God who whispered into his ear to seek out and kill the evil girl Beth. At the trial, West made only a minimal effort to exonerate Shaver. The airman was found guilty. Though an appeals court later ruled that he'd had an unfair trial, he was convicted again in the retrial. In 1958, on his 33rd birthday, he was executed by the electric chair. He maintained his innocence the whole time. The trial, which hinged on Shaver's testimony, might have ended differently had the jury known about West's past. According to newly surfaced papers from West's archives, the psychiatrist had some of the clearest, most nefarious ties of any scientist to the CIA's Project MKUltra. West's files, especially his correspondence with the CIA's longtime poisons expert, Sidney Gottlieb, shed new light on one of the most infamous projects in the agency's history, likely comprising more than 149 sub-projects and at least 185 researchers working at institutions across America and Canada. MKUltra was, as the New York Times put it, a secret 25-year, $25 million effort by the CIA to learn how to control the human mind. Its experiments violated international laws, not to mention the agency's charter, which forbids domestic activity. At the trial, West maintained that Shaver had suffered a bout of temporary insanity on the night of Cher Jo Horton's killing, but he argued that Shaver was quite sane now. In the courtroom, Shaver didn't look that way. One newspaper account said he sat through the strenuous sessions like a man in a trance, saying nothing, never rising to stretch or smoke, though he was a known chain smoker. Large portions of West's truth serum interview with Shaver were read into the court record. The doctor had used leading questions to walk the entranced Shaver through the crime. "Tell me about when you took your clothes off, Jimmy," he'd said. The transcript of the interview, which survived among West's papers, also showed West trying to prove that Shaver had repressed memories. "Jimmy, do you remember when something like this happened before? Or, after you took her clothes off, what did you do?" "I never did take her clothes off," Shaver said. The interview was divided into thirds, and the middle third hadn't been recorded. When the transcript picked up, it said, "Shaver is crying. He has been confronted with all the facts repeatedly." West asked, "Now you remember it all, don't you, Jimmy?" "Yes, sir," Shaver replied. Though lawyers scrutinized Shaver's medical history, little mention was made of the base hospital where West's archived letters indicate he had conducted his MKUltra experiments. Shaver had suffered from migraines so debilitating that he dunked his head in a bucket of ice water when he felt one coming on. His condition was severe enough that the Air Force had recommended him for a 2-year experimental program. The doctor who'd attempted to recruit him was not named in court records or transcripts. On the stand, West said he'd never gotten around to seeing whether Shaver had been treated in the experimental program. Lackland officials claimed there was no record of him in their master index of patients, but curiously, according to the base archivist, all the records for patients in 1954 had been maintained, with one exception. The file for last names beginning with SA through ST had vanished. West's professional fascination with LSD was practically as old as the drug itself. For several decades, he was one of an elite cadre of scientists using it in top-secret research. Lysergic acid diethylamide was synthesized in 1938 by chemists at Switzerland's Sandoz Industries, but it was not introduced as a pharmaceutical until 1947. In the 50s, when the CIA began to experiment on humans with it, it was a new substance. Albert Hofmann, the Swiss scientist who discovered its hallucinogenic qualities in 1943, described it as a sacred drug that gestured toward the mystical experience of a deeper, comprehensive reality. In the 50s, even before hippies embraced the drug, very few people took LSD without having somebody being a trip leader, claimed drug researcher Charles Fisher. The suggestibility from LSD was akin to that associated with hypnosis. West had studied the two in tandem. You can tell somebody to hurt somebody, but you call it something else, Fisher explained. Hammer the nail into the wood, and the wood, perhaps, is a human being. West seems to have used chemicals liberally in his medical practice, and his tactics left an indelible mark on the psychiatrists who worked with him. One of them, Gilbert Rose, was so baffled by the Shaver case that he went on to write a play about it. In my 50 years in the profession, that was the most dramatic moment ever, when he clapped his hands to his face and remembered killing the girl, Rose said in 2002 of Shaver in the Truth Serum interview. But Rose was shocked when he discovered that West had hypnotized Shaver in addition to giving him sodium pentothal. Hypnotism, he said, was not part of the protocol for the interview. He'd also never known how West had found out about the case right away. We were involved from the first day, Rose recalled. Jolly phoned me the morning of the murder. He initiated it. West claimed he was in the courtroom the day Shaver was sentenced to death. Around this time, he became vehemently opposed to capital punishment. Did he know his experiments might have led to the execution of an innocent man and the death of a child? If his correspondence with CIA head of MKUltra Gottlieb, predating the crime by just a year, had been presented at trial, would the outcome have been the same? Another colleague of Dr. Jolly West on the board of the FMSF is an American psychiatrist, author, researcher, and educator by the name of Paul McHugh, who became the University Distinguished Service Professor of Psychiatry at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He served as a co-founder and subsequent board member of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, and throughout the 90s, he was actively challenging the idea of recovered memory, or the notion that people could suddenly and spontaneously remember childhood sexual abuse. In 2002, McHugh happened to be appointed to a panel assembled by the Roman Catholic Church to look into sexual abuse by Catholic priests in the United States. According to the New York Times, this appointment was controversial as McHugh had previously served as expert witness in the defense of numerous priests accused of child sexual abuse. The director of the Survivors Network of those abused by priests was appalled at McHugh's inclusion. Another notable character worth mentioning is American psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, who is best known in relation to the misinformation effect, false memory, and criticism of recovered memory therapies. In 2002, Loftus was ranked 58th in the review of General Psychology's list of the 100 most influential psychological researchers of the 20th century. The following year, Loftus received the award for Distinguished Scientific Applications of Psychology from the American Psychological Association. That same year, Loftus was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Elizabeth Loftus was also a member of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation Scientific Advisory Board and has provided expert testimony or consultation for lawyers in over 300 court cases. Her legal cases include some of the most prominent and controversial figures in recent memory, and Loftus consistently stepped in as an expert witness in order to testify on behalf of the defense. She's been involved with the cases of Ted Bundy, O.J. Simpson, Rodney King, Oliver North, Martha Stewart, Scooter Libby, Michael Jackson, the Hillside Strangler, the Menendez brothers, both Terry Nichols and Timothy McVeigh, as well as testifying for the defense regarding the killing of Susan Berman in Robert Durst's trial for murder. During Harvey Weinstein's trial for rape and sexual assault in 2020, it was Loftus who testified for the defense. And if that's not enough, her most recent high-profile case happened when she testified for the defense during Ghislaine Maxwell's trial regarding sex trafficking of underage girls for Jeffrey Epstein. Clinical psychologist Catherine Gold, at the September 1993 National Conference on Crimes Against Children in Washington, D.C., claimed that the studies of Elizabeth Loftus ignore past research on trauma and its influence on memory. My concern about Elizabeth Loftus, Gold said, is that she has stated in print, and correctly so, that her data tells us nothing about the nature of memory or traumatic events, and yet she has failed to protest the misapplication of her findings by groups who are involved in discrediting the accounts survivors are giving of their traumatic history. I believe that Dr. Loftus, like other psychologists, has an ethical responsibility to do everything possible to ensure that her research findings are interpreted and applied accurately and are not manipulated to serve the political agenda of groups like the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. I question whether she has met this ethical responsibility. As Alex Constantine wrote in 1996, the debate's bloodiest stage is the courtroom. The hired guns of Martin Orne's circle of psychiatrists are constantly called upon to blow smoke at the jury's gallery to conceal CIA mind control operations. This branch of the psychiatric community is steeped in the programming of serial killers, political assassins, and experiments on involuntary subjects. Agency psychiatrists on the witness stand direct the press away from the CIA and the prosecution to a predetermined end. Martin Orne's high-toned psychologizing in the Hillside Strangler case, for example, is a strategy adopted by the False Memory Syndrome Foundation to stifle the cries of mind control survivors. According to the 1997 July-August issue of the Columbia Journalism Review, rarely has such a strange and little understood organization had such a profound effect on media coverage of such a controversial matter. The False Memory Syndrome Foundation is an aggressive, well-financed PR machine, adept at manipulating the press, harassing its critics, and mobilizing a diverse army of psychiatrists, outspoken academics, expert defense witnesses, litigious lawyers, Freud bashers, critics of psychotherapy, and devastated parents. What if I told you that an organization existed with the primary goal of systematically discrediting victims of child sexual abuse? A foundation conveniently and contemporarily created to seed a pseudoscientific falsehood into the public consciousness, while simultaneously serving as the cleanup crew for some of the most prolific crimes ever committed or facilitated as a result of covert action and clandestine special operations. In this story, we're all Manchurian candidates, escaping the confines of a society largely under hypnosis, only to find ourselves once again at the precipice, in a brave new world, under a dystopian version of mind control.